They called it a transaction, as if the world were a marketplace, and the skin and breath inside a child could be counted like sugar barrels. Son for son, the mistress had once said to the farm owner in passing, and the phrase settled like a stone in Luía's chest. It was 1798, and this is a dramatized reconstitution inspired by oral histories. The first scene is small and stubborn, a baby's fist sticky with milk, curled around a woman's finger so fiercely that the knuckle whitened. The baby, Elisa, breathed against Luía's breast with the easy, unlearned trust of the very young. Outside, the cane fields hissed in wind and dry sun. Inside the slave quarters, the boards of the floor had been worn to near transparency by 100 small feet, and the weight of knees praying without words. The smell of cut cane and hot earth braided itself with the soft, warm odor of a child. Luía looked at the baby, until looking became a kind of geography. She memorized the tiny dent by the left ear, the way Elisa's lashes browned at the tips, the irregularity of a tooth beginning to push up like a pale island. When the men from the big house came, all business in their boots and the practice of counting, Luía's world narrowed to those details. Names, prices, the talk of markets, noise against the silence where she kept her daughter's face. They came with ledger and ledger's voice. "A girl of good stock," one of them said, tapping a calloused finger against the page. The capataz stood a little apart, chin set like a lever. The mistress, the woman who lived above the wide windows of the big house, whose skirts brushed the ground like a shadow, watched with a face that did not give much away. Women in the senzala, the slave quarters, watched for what she did not give away. It was how they learned to read a household. The sail cleaved through Luía like a sudden river. She tried to move when they took the baby, tried to wedge herself between cart and skin. A hand, firm, decisive, used to stopping the small rebellions of those it owned, closed over Luía's wrist and held. It was not pain that stopped her, not then. It was the cold administrative certainty. They had paper. They had price. There was always paper. The child was gone before the eyes could finish deciding where to look. Afterward, the nights were a geography of absence. Luía kept waking as if to check that the bed beside her might still be warm, that a little body might stir and roll into her palm. Instead, there was a hollow at her chest that could not be filled with words. She learned the limits of language anew. She could name every little thing about Elisa, but the naming only carved the hollowness deeper. Elisa. The name became a rhythm. She pressed it under her breath until it sounded like a prayer and a promise both. Others came to that silence. The senzala hummed in its own way, shafts of lamp smoke, a chorus of sighs, the clack of sewing needles. Women moved around one another with the careful choreography of those who must keep many truths. There were hands that would furtively warm soup beyond the measured ration, hands that would tuck a scrap of cloth under a hem to carry a secret in, hands that would hold a child a little longer when the capataz's back was turned. Joaquina, whose laugh could cut through the thickest despair, took to sitting with Luía in the dark, making a place for grief where it could be tended. "Say her name," Joaquina would say sometimes, not as demand but as invitation. "Say Elisa so it keeps shape. People forget everything you don't name." Elisa. The syllable was both a talisman and a lash. It kept the child present, but it also made the absence palpable, something that could be felt under the ribs like a bruise. Life continued its ugly necessities, work in the cane, the repair of tools, the mending of animal harnesses, the big house dinners where the mistress's cloth napkins were pressed crisp and her voice held the mannered softness that kept others beneath. To the world of the house, Luía was a resource, strong back, careful hands, a woman who could soothe screaming infants even as her own body kept a hollowness. To the world of the senzala, she was a woman returning each night with an emptiness like a new limb taken. No one who saw the stacks of ledgers or the sweep of those collars felt the hollow like she did. Months passed, and grief calcified into something else, a patient, measuring anger that measured the time of guards' rounds and the sleep cycles of the dog in the yard. Luía began to learn the rhythms of the plantation as if they were a language she read with her body. When the overseer walked the southwest perimeter, when the mistress walked past the kitchens humming, when the shadow of the veranda sheltered gossip. She learned to move like a thread through this pattern, unseen and yet present. The planning did not happen alone. It never did. There were the secret networks, the unnamed women who labored with their bodies by day and with their minds by night, stitching messages into hems, passing a small coin hidden in a loaf, whispering to one another across latrines. Joaquina and others whose names Luía would not speak aloud often for fear that names themselves drew danger, became the architecture of the plan. They were not romantic conspirators, but the practical souls of survival. A mother taught another how to watch the capataz's eyes for signs of loose attention. An older woman who had been on other farms told stories about roots where the soil was softer in which to bury small things. There was a seamstress who could stitch an extra pocket under a cloaked hem, and a man, Benedito, who travelled between plantations with a cart of odds and sundries, a broker whose silence could be bought with coin or empathy or both. Benedito's cart prowled like a shadow across the back roads. He sold glassware bottles, a thing that looked like a bottle, and contained goods that could be used in more than one way. His eyes were quick, and his hands were slow in a way that made him trustworthy to those who learned what to trust. Luía first heard his name in a whisper, like a rumor of a remedy. Benedito, who had a knack for knowing what people needed to forget or remember, who carried powders and perfumes and things wrapped in cloth. They met under the pretense of trade. Benedito set down his cart with a small ritual, unfastening rope, lifting a cloth. Luía watched him like a careful animal watches a trap. He did not speak of what he carried. He advertised nothing explicit. But the women around him knew how to listen for what he did not say. He had something for making marks disappear, they said. Benedito's voice was a low thing. He would say, "I bring wares and advice, and I leave you to your own ways." That was often how men like him presented themselves. They offered things without offering judgment. The moral architecture of the plan was not simple. There were questions asked more than once, beneath the same lamp that had once warmed a sleeping child's head. Was this right? Who would be hurt beyond the mistress? Could a name like justice be kept pure if delivered by a dirty hand? There were quick answers given by the women who had suffered, solutions pronounced with the sharpness of hunger. But there were also voices that paused, that weighed the cost. A young woman newly aware of how the world could be bent by need argued that such an act would unleash a weather of reprisals. A grandmother, who had been beaten into silence many times and who had a map of past consequences in her own skin, made the ledger of suffering long and detailed. In the end, they kept the plan because grief did not ask for the permission of ethical committees. Grief asked for a single practical answer, and Luía's grief wanted the mistress to feel a wound that might tell her what it meant to be stripped. The plan was not glamorized, it was a stubborn, honest thing. To make visible the damage the owning class assumed belonged only to the owned. Yet the women who moved with Luía did so with boundaries. They refused any suggestion that cruelty be mirrored for its own sake. There was no sadism in their scheming. There was only the cautious, determined attempt to make the mistress know that something had been taken that could not be repocketed. A voice in the back would sometimes murmur, "We are making a language she understands." The language would be pain, but not gratuitous. It would be a message, not a trophy. To prepare, they crafted rituals of secrecy. A scarf, hollowed out like a tiny purse, became repository for messages. A child's rattle would be used to hide a small object. Clothes were mended with secret stitches that pulled a fabric into an impossible fold. Each action was a small theft from the world that had stolen them. They taught the children proverbs that could be used as signals. Say, "The moon is bright," and someone would answer with a lullaby, meaning the path was clear. Allusions and metaphors were a small army in themselves. Luía kept a daily ledger of moments in her memory. She catalogued the times her mistress had refused to look her in the eye, the afternoons when the mistress took pleasure in displays of wealth, the day the mistress had patted Elisa's soft hair only to remark later that she could sell her for a good price. These small violences stacked into a portrait. Outside their careful mapping, the plantation maintained its own rituals of domination. The mistress's world was one of polished surfaces. In the big house, she entertained guests and read old Portuguese novels for the sake of appearances. She kept a garden where roses were pruned to exactness. Those who moved within those rooms learned the cues, how to step aside when the mistress's heel came down, how to laugh at the right volume. The mistress, for her part, moved between benevolence and calculation. In public she might feed an infant a warmed spoonful of milk. In private she would bargain a life away with an expression that did not betray the price. Luía watched the mistress the way a sailor watches weather. There were days when the mistress's face softened, on the surface only, and days when it hardened with an almost animal vigilance. Luía did not hate the mistress for being a woman. She hated her because she held the authority to wound and to barter. This distinction mattered. It allowed Luía to keep the plan focused on structures rather than on personal animus. She would not have targeted any woman simply because she was a woman. She targeted the woman through whom the institution of ownership expressed itself. The clandestine network used whispers as a currency. Secrets slid from mouth to mouth with the care of paper animals. At night, when the stars opened like wounds in the sky and the sounds of distant dogs made the air thin, Luía would sit with the others and go over the plan as one would go over a prayer. Joaquina would check the seamstress's work. A man who moved in the servants' world would create diversions at the moments needed. Benedito would arrange for supply to be passed in a small vial, wrapped in cloth, and hidden inside a jar of affordable oil. Nothing about these arrangements sought to teach a method. They were the gestures of people who had been taught by necessity. Even as they stitched and passed objects, they rehearsed the stories they would tell afterward. There was a political intelligence in that. They practiced explaining absence, practiced making their grief legible to a world that otherwise reduced them to inventory. They were careful about witnesses. Rumors, they knew, were powerful and dangerous. A stray remark could turn into a schedule of punishment. Thus, they pruned speech like overgrown roots, leaving only what had to be left. Luía carried with her always a small keepsake of Elisa, a remnant of cloth, a corner of a blanket, the spot where Elisa had fallen asleep and left her hair loose. It smelled of the child still. She would breathe it in sometimes until the scent filled her mouth and blurred the present. In the midst of planning, these moments of memory were also acts of worship. She held the past in the same reverent way a mother might preserve the after-image of a child's smile. The daily face of the plantation continued its cruel choreography. A new hand, Zedas Correntes, an overgrown capataz with fists like old pulleys, made his rounds with an air of someone who had learned to fashion power out of fear. He spoke rarely, but his presence was the sort of punctuation that made the slaves' breathing measured. The mistress, whose name in the ledger was Donna Mariana, maintained her household, both because of personal taste and because it affirmed the social order. People in her house were taught that order was natural as the harvest. But the more order she imposed, the easier it became for a hidden fissure to grow. One rainy afternoon, when the fields were in the humid, heavy pause that comes after a storm, Luía and Joaquina spoke in hushed tones inside the mending room. The rain made the roof sing, a thin, relentless sound that swallowed conversation. They passed a small cup between them. The cup was nothing, it was in truth an ordinary soup cup, but in its rim was a wedge that held the scent of something else. Benedito had arranged the exchange. He had needed a place to hide the object as much as they needed a way to receive it. No one spoke of the nature of that object in anything but the broadest terms. They called it the thing, or the answer. That morning, Benedito had been present in the yard with his cart, as if by chance. He had spoken with the blacksmith, joked with the mistress's footman, asked after dogs. He had lingered where the sun made the stone warm and let his hands lie in his lap. Only later did he call Luía aside, with the deliberate slowness of someone who knows how to be invisible in plain sight. He smiled, as though to hide something sorrowful or maybe proud. Luía accepted the parcel with 2 hands and felt the weight of it like a small heartbeat. She did not open it. It was wrapped. Its thingness was an interior that belonged only to the secret. There were other exchanges that did not fit into the neat notion of conspiracy, but rather into everyday survival. A quarrel with the mistress about a broken dish that would be blamed on Luía's clumsy hand. The sale of a rooster that would be pocketed and its money used to buy extra food. A child hidden under a bed when a trader came by. These were the slower, less heroic parts of the network. They were the marrow. In the weeks that followed, Luía became a patient stalker of routine. She learned the mistress's movements, the way she laced her gloves, the tilt of her head when she listened for news, the way she put one hand on the banister as she descended for dinner. She watched the capataz sleep in a chair and noted the slackness of his jaw. She memorized which servant had the key to the larder and which did not. She watched the dog's sleeping patterns and the times the yard gate clicked with the heavy sound of metal. All this was the making of an intimate map. Joaquina taught Luía how to speak to fear without letting it speak for her. "Fear is a thing that wants to be tended," she said once, her voice small like someone who has kept candlelight alive through a long night. "Do not let it tell you everything. Use it to sharpen you." They practiced walking in the mistress's shadow and not being seen. The more Luía moved, the less the big house's routine felt immovable. Yet under all the planning, beneath the map and the hidden pockets, was another set of small human things that made the decision unbearable and irremediable. There were evenings when Luía imagined Elisa at a distant market, the child's hair mussed by the wind, a stranger's lap taking the place Luía used to call home. She imagined a woman, an owner, a buyer, trimming the child's features like a jeweler picks a precious stone. Those imaginings were not abstract. They were sensory and precise. She pictured the smell in strange kitchens, the dull throb of a stomach not held by her hands. She imagined the child learning not to say her mother's name, and that thought fastened itself like a hook. The women around her told stories of others who had lost children to sale and who had found various ways to endure. Some sang themselves to sleep with lullabies turned inside out, melodies that began as comfort ended as curses upon the ones who had traded away flesh. There were older women who had never found a counter to the ledger. They grew quiet and watched the sky. There were younger ones who had not yet learned how to make options from nothing. It was in these exchanges, these small muttered myths, that the plan kept its moral skin. Not an unthinking lust for revenge, but a ledger of balances sought where the law had refused to balance. Luía's nights became lessons in calculation. She would stand in the dark where the walls leaked night air and think of ways to make the mistress's life narrower by showing her something she refused to see. It was not enough to make the mistress feel pain. Luía wanted the mistress to understand the arithmetic of ownership. If the mistress could hold for a moment the same sense of loss that had hollowed Luía's chest, perhaps she would see the inhumanity she had been taught to make ordinary. Yet they also planned for consequence. The Quilombo, the refuge, stood like an imagined shore. It was a community where others had fled and found new structures. They spoke of it in fragments. Who lived there? Who could be trusted? How the path wound through river and bush. The Quilombo was not a fairy tale. It was a hard, dangerous possibility. To go meant leaving behind any hope of returning to the known world. The women did not fuss over that decision. They had lived always in exile from justice. For Luía, the Quilombo was a place where the language of possession might not rule. It is worth noting how the plantation itself reacted to small disturbances. Rumors, once planted, grew like weeds. A missing hammer here, a broken railing there. These small things were assigned to negligent servants and punished accordingly. The ownership who lived in the big house used punishment as a means to remake the world in their image. An incident, an affront to property, an act that made owners feel less secure, elicited response beyond the immediate. Punishment did not only chastise, it performed the renewal of hierarchy. They made examples to bind the rest. In this social geometry, Luía and her allies were not naive. They understood that nothing they did would abolish the system. They understood that any action would ripple outward, often striking the least culpable first. That knowledge made the moral questions heavier. When there were disputes about whether the act was worth it, Luía would place Elisa's name into the middle of the argument, like a small, hot coal that could burn even the best arguments down to their truth. People softened and hardened in turns. When words failed, they agreed. To do nothing was also to consent. One clear morning, Luía watched as the mistress received a visitor from the coast, a man with a sheen of salt in his skin and a ledger under his arm. He spoke in the comfortable language of trade. He did not look at the people who worked the fields. His eyes scanned the house's holdings as if they were a garden to be pruned and then sold. After he left, the mistress ordered that extra measures be taken to keep her household safe. as if the mere presence of a buyer could awaken any sleeping conscience. Her servants were watched with a new, sharper vigilance. Punishments became quicker, and the capataz's voice sounded like a whip. The plantation tightened. So these things always happen. The more threatened a house feels, the more it clings to the levers it has. The day Luía received the parcel from Benedito, everything else in the world seemed small. Benedito had wrapped what he carried in an old cloth and spoken to her in a voice that tried to be neutral. "Be careful," he said, the words almost unnecessary. But it is notable how danger and tenderness in these places often share breath. He had not asked what she intended, only how she would keep it. Luía's hand closed around the wrapped thing and felt its modest, steady weight. She tucked it beneath her skirt, against the hollow she carried. She returned to the rhythm of labor, heavy load on shoulder, the swing of a hoe, the scrape of a mop. Every movement after that was a practice in diplomacy. She smiled at the mistress when she passed in the corridor and felt like a woman who wore masks for a living. She carried the weight of the thing and the weight of her secret like two different stones, both heavy. At night she would lay the parcel on the small shelf by her cot and look at it as one might look at a sleeping child. It was dangerous even to think of it being a sleeping child, she knew. But human minds make stories of everything it seems. The parcel's contours would sometimes turn into the image of a small hand, and she would reach as if to touch the air and wake a phantom. The women rehearsed their alibis. If suspicion ever came, they would be ready with plausible denials. The parcel was a kind of medicine left by a traveling apothecary. The thing had been meant for cleaning a stain. It was an ordinary object misinterpreted by jealous tongues. They knew how to prepare for rumor, how to fold truth into a garment that would resist inquiry. The plantations had ways of conducting inquiry that left no neutral arbiter. Justice here, if justice existed, often meant the owner's assessment. For that reason, the women built their story as carefully as they built their plan. On some nights when the house creaked and the world smelled like rain and wood smoke, Luía would speak to Elisa, as if the child could hear. She would whisper small things into the dark. "You will have a name that is not sold," she told her. "You will not be counted as a thing." These words were equal parts vow and incantation. She spoke aloud because speech within the house was safer than silence. Silence could be a vacuum that invited the worst imaginations. Other nights she held the parcel and thought not of the act itself but of its consequences. Would the mistress be changed? Would the owner of the plantation think twice before bargaining a baby? The answers were murky. What history teaches is that acts like these do not often change laws. They change people in ways small and private, inscrutable to official record. But Luía wanted at least one person to feel the emptiness that would not lessen with time or coin. As the days compacted toward the moment, the plantation's weather seemed to shift. The dogs were growlier at night. The mistress added a lock to her writing desk. The capataz began to patrol in pairs. The air itself felt charged, the way it does before lightning. And yet life went on with the insistence of necessity. Meals were cooked, children were swaddled, men drafted into work. Then, one evening when the sun was sliding off the horizon, and the big house cast a long shade over the yard, the moment arrived to test whether the plan held. Luía moved with a measured calm that had become a practiced art form. She put on the plain wrapper of her life, the dress she wore when she wanted to be unseen, and folded the parcel into the inner seam. Her hands were steady. Her breath did not hurry. Beside her, Joaquina adjusted a shawl and gave a nod that was less a greeting than the sealing of an agreement. They walked toward the big house as if they were going to ask for something small, a drop of broth, the mistress's blessing for a child. No one in the yard had the right to read them. They had rehearsed their gestures the way a group prepares a play where the props must remain secret. The evening light made everything nostalgic. The big house's paint gleamed like a promise, and the shadows lengthened like old memories. Luía's mind catalogued the small obstacles still between them and the big house. The footman who tended the main door, the capataz's habit of stopping to look at the sky on the east side, the mistress's rumoured habit of stepping into the corridor at dusk to check on the servants' lamps. Each possible interference was another variable in an equation she had practiced until she believed she could solve for it. They moved, and the world around them seemed to tighten, as though the plantation had become the belly of some great animal about to take a breath. The dog barked once, quickly swallowed by the hush. A lantern in a distant room threw a pool of yellow light that trembled. Luía's hand brushed the parcel, and she felt its life under her palm as clearly as if it were a heartbeat. She thought of Elisa and said the name under her breath, Elisa, like a charm that might alter fortune. A single syllable hung between the trees and the house, and seemed to know its gravity. They reached the edge of the veranda. The big house loomed, formal windows, draperies kept tight, a garden of clipped hedges that the mistress tended with the kind of hands that expected obedience from everything they touched. The mistress was not there yet. That Luía knew was a small mercy. Another second and the calculus of chance would shift. She paused on the threshold, the parcel heavy at her side. Behind her the yard breathed whispered advice. Beside her, Joaquina's eyes had taken on a hard, familial care. In front, the darkness in the windows looked like a mouth. The plan had been set into motion, and motion felt irreversible. Luía slid her fingers into the fabric of the parcel, as if testing the world's willingness to move. She felt the roughness of the cloth, the faint scent that Benedito had left clinging to its folds, a trace of oil, of old wood. She breathed in and tasted possibility and risk, both the same flavor, iron and salt. At that instant the mistress opened the door. She did not come out with the announced grandeur of authority. She emerged as any woman does into an evening, in the private economy of her own curiosity. Her dress caught a little of the last light. For a second, she looked like someone the world had made by accident into power. Her face registered nothing in particular, and that thin indifference was the most infuriating thing of all. Luía stepped forward. The world contracted to two people and the parcel. The capataz, perhaps alerted by the click of a heel, turned his head fractionally. Dogs shifted their weight. Across the yard, a child dropped a toy, sound scattered like a dry leaf. Luía's hand moved almost of its own accord. The parcel uncoiled beneath her fingers, and she felt its inner content like a small, terrible promise. She knew, in the gut way people know when an act crosses a threshold, that there was no turning back. She felt the tilt of history under her feet. She felt the weight of every mother who had lost a child and been told to accept it. She spoke the name. "Elisa," she said, not pleading, not triumphant. The word hung like a bell. People around them might not have understood the weight of that syllable, but those who were in the seam of the plan did. It was both invocation and indictment. The mistress looked down at her with the mildness of someone whose world had armored her to feeling. For an instant, the mistress's visage was a field of potential, of fear, of confusion, of the first human stirrings of remorse, perhaps. Whatever passed behind the mistress's eyes in that cut second could not be known by others. It was private, like the way someone tastes coffee first to see if it is bitter or not. Luía moved, and what followed was swift, not because it needed to be, but because momentum took over what deliberation had applied. The parcel moved, the cloth shifted, a small action that made the world tilt. There was a cry, then a sound that was more like an animal's alarm than any human articulation. The capataz lunged. The mistress clapped a hand to her face with a gesture of surprise, and then something like horror. A scream was choked off, replaced by a sound that would haunt the household's memory for years. It is necessary to pause here and say what must be said plainly. The narrative does not linger on how this was done. It is enough to know that an action occurred, that it ruptured the plantation's expectable flow, and that the mistress was left altered in a way that everyone could see. The law of the house, immediate and merciless, asserted itself. The mistress's comfort became the first priority. The servants' bodies were now at risk for the act. Men ran, women dropped to their knees, a child began to cry. The air shivered with the sense of events out of their authorized order. Panic folded into the place like a new structure. The mistress's voice, always measured, now sounded higher. The capataz shouted for water and for herbs, and for the white linen cloth that the big house kept on hand for every imaginable small emergency. They rapped, they bathed, they tried to assess, but assessment in such moments is a public performance. The household's concern, however sincere, also served to reassert authority. They would show how decisively they could respond, how superior their resources, how quickly they could re-establish themselves as the center. Outside, the senzala felt the tremor like a physical force. News moves fast in places where people have learned how to listen. A shout, a dog, the capataz's foot. Rumors seeded themselves into the rows of sleep. Immediately there was a hungry curiosity and a sharp fear. The owners would turn their surveillance into accusations and punishments to re-establish the balance lost by the event. Stories circulated that retribution would be severe. The women who had assisted, silently, anonymously, tensed. They had always known this was a possibility. Luía, in the center of a convulsion she had set into motion, felt the world tilt. The taste of iron and rain filled her mouth. She held herself like someone who had found the limit of her own makeable moral world and crossed it. Around her, people moved as if called by a strange music, some to tend, some to accuse. No one yet knew who would be blamed, who would be hanged or flogged or sold. The capataz already spoke in the language of those who would punish to prevent contagion. The owner, if he could be roused, would decide how to use the incident to reassert his power. The mistress, Donna Mariana, sank into a chair with a quietness that frightened those around her most. Her face was partly covered, partly revealed. There were not gory details to tell. There were, instead, the public marks of outrage and confusion. That is what made the plantation's power uneasy. The mistress was no longer an image of unassailable separation. She was, for a moment, exposed. In the days immediately after, the house enacted its script for such disturbances. Messengers were sent, the owner's men sought counsel, punishments were prepared. The capataz ordered roll calls and inspections with the kind of intensity that suggested he equated such measures with security. The senzala was shaken by raids, searches for evidence, more than for truth. People were questioned in ways meant to elicit fear. A few unlucky souls were singled out for punishment on flimsy grounds. The weapons of the big house are many: law, rumor, and the lash. For Luía, the moment that had been the axis of months, i.e., the act itself, was the hinge on which a new sequence of losses would swing. She had not wished to make the plantation empty of all safety. She had wished to break the mistress's complacency in a way that would make selling a child feel impossible, at least to the person who might do it again. What she had not predicted in its fullness was how swiftly the structure of power would bend every incident back into its own hands. Reprisals rippled through the senzala, stronger patrols, punitive sales of other people, cruel displays meant as deterrent. The plantation tried to repair the wound, not by addressing its cause, but by stamping harder on those who had few protections. And Luía did the only thing she had planned for afterward. She fled. Flight in those moments is the practical insistence of people without protections. It is not heroic in the sense of grand speeches. It is furtive, necessary, almost animal. She did not go far at first. She moved through the brush like a shadow, carrying what she could in the seams of her clothing. Behind her, the plantation erupted with a fury that sought to remap the event into a demonstration of authority. Men searched the river paths. Gates were locked. Dogs were set to track. The Quilombo opened itself like a harbor to those who came. It was not paradise. It was a community formed under the pressure of survival, with its own rules and its own debates. When Luía arrived, she was taken in not with immediate celebration, but with the kind of sober aid that kinship lends to the desperate. They washed her, fed her, and listened. The communal hearth became a place of questions. Was what she had done just? Did the cost, those who would be punished, the additional sales outweigh the message? The Quilombo's elders, who had sat through many such debates on other nights, asked these questions in measured tones. They did not give blanket approval or condemnation. They listened and they told stories. Within the refuge, Luía found a kind of judgment that was neither condemnation nor absolution, but a community's attempt to understand itself. Some spoke of the act with sober recognition, others with moral distaste. There was no easy answer. The elders emphasized survival and the right to defend one's children, while cautioning that responses born of private vengeance could spill beyond their intended targets. Yet the same elders had themselves carried pain as currency for decades. Their scarring was testimony to the way the world had offered few legal remedies. The plantation, after a week, resumed much of its daily business. The owner posted guards and took measures to prevent any knowledge from escaping too neatly to the wider press of the region. Men who had been suspected of involvement were interrogated harshly. A few were sold off as punishment. News of what had happened spread in varying retellings. Some saw Luía as a heroine, others judged her as a criminal. Midden voices in taverns and market squares offered pronouncements that simplified the drama into images for easy consumption. The owner's account emphasized the violence of the act and the danger of leniency. In his telling, the household had been the passive victim of a barbarism that needed to be stamped out before it corroded profit and order. Men from neighboring estates rode in to confer, their faces flat with interest at any sign that inventory and dominion might be reasserted. The capataz increased patrols, the gates were bolted, and the ledger lines were inked with new notations, names, suspicions, calculations. Rumor, which is a different kind of ledger, set to work within hours. Who had been seen whispering with whom? Which woman had been unusually tidy in the days before? Which man had lingered a moment too long by the river? If this story is reaching you, subscribe to hear more recovered memories. The immediate round of punishments was precise and merciless in the ways plantations had perfected over generations. A handful of men deemed minimally suspicious were sold at the next market as both retribution and spectacle. Their removal served the dual purpose of vengeance and example. They were listed in the owner's account as necessary adjustments. In the senzala, the price of a look that resembled guilt rose overnight. People began to watch their neighbors as if vigilance might somehow save them from being chosen. The capataz, Zé das Correntes, redoubled his displays of dominance, swift lashings for small infractions, extra labor for those who had the misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong lantern light. Not everyone believed the house's version. In kitchens and market alleys, and the small shifting circles where freed people and fugitives traded news, different stories wound themselves into being. Some whispered that it had been an accident, that a parcel misconstrued had spilled and caused ruin. Others shrugged and said, perhaps defensively, that desperate people do desperate things. The truth, like so many things in that place, split into pieces and took different shapes, depending on who needed it to be a hurt for themselves or a warning. Within a week, the owner's men had traced one slender thread back to Benedito. The traveling broker, who navigated between venues with a practiced invisibility, had become suspicious to those whose world is always measured by profit and rumor. They found his cart idled at the river crossing, empty of the particular wrappings he used, and they pieced together a narrative. Whether Benedito had known the purpose of the thing he sold, or whether he had only suspected and chosen to look away, did not interest the owner as much as the need for an explanation that would absolve the house's fault lines. Benedito fled before black riders came for him. How far he got, whether he crossed to another province or sank into anonymity in a town that did not ask questions, was the kind of detail that legal records do not always record. People in the senzala said his name for a while, and then stopped, as if speaking him aloud might summon a consequence. Joaquina, who had sat with Luía in the dark and sewn the secret seams, was not so fortunate. An informant, someone terrified, someone promised a better ration, someone whose own ledger of threats had grown too heavy, spoke of Joaquina's furtive presence by the mending room. The capataz seized upon the mention like a man who had found a rope to throw into a well. Joaquina was taken before dawn, her hair unbrushed, her hands smelling of starch and thread, her laughter still lodged in her throat, like a sound that did not yet believe what it heard. The punishment she received was a public thing. It was meant to be a spectacle that would scald solidarity into solitude. The senzala mourned with a private noiselessness. People refrained from telling obvious stories too loudly, as if narrative itself might become an accusation. Luía, watching from the shivering safety of flight, felt the loss of Joaquina like the second slicing of an old wound. It was not merely that a friend had been taken, It was that the web of people who had made survival practical had been rent. The cost of causing a ripple inside a pond whose edges were defended by men with whips had been calculated, and it struck at the most vulnerable first. News of these retributions reached the Quilombo not as abstract information, but as palpable proof of the plantation's method: damage, then repair by force. The Quilombo elders, who had seen too many cycles of retaliation and refashioning of dominion, listened as Luía recounted the smallest details she could bear: how the mistress had smelled of lemon oil that day, how the parcel had felt like a heart under her hand. She would not speak of the specifics of the act. That was a compact she kept with those who had helped her. In the circle by the fire, the elders did not press her for more than she was willing to give. They asked instead what she needed and what she thought might be done to protect others. Within the Quilombo, the moral conversation about Luía's act was multi-voiced and textured. Some said plainly, "To take from the one who takes is a language of return." Others, speaking out of experience, warned that revenge often becomes a ladder upon which new tyrannies climb. An older man who had lost a brother in a similar pattern of retribution sighed and said that any act that made owners feel insecure would invite a cascade of cruelty visited upon the innocent. A woman with calloused palms, hands that had built huts, raised children, salted meat, reminded the assembly that sometimes survival needs to be as sharp as a knife. She did not celebrate the act, but she did not condemn it either. Luía listened and sometimes spoke. She said the daughter's name in the rhythm she had kept for so long, Elisa, and each time it arrived like a weight that steadied argument. People leaned toward her story when she said the name. It had become a measure by which the Quilombo judged the economy of grief and action. None of these conversations produced an easy answer. The elders proposed instead a ritual that was practical. Send messengers to farm families near the Quilombo to warn them of increased patrols. Teach children pathways that avoided known trackers. Keep certain crops lower to decrease the plantation's investment in the area. Resistance here was not one act, but many small, cunning adjustments. Luía began to live inside other people's customs. She learned the Quilombo's routines, the way the tide of labor shaped the day, which benches in the meeting house took the dawn dry air, who preferred to prune the medicinal garden at dusk. She found shelter in the cadence of ordinary work. That the mundane could be a balm was itself a kind of wisdom. It is possible to be both haunted and to hang beans for winter. People can carry sorrow in a pocket while also tending seedlings. Not all who welcomed her in the Quilombo offered unconditional warmth. There were suspicions, sometimes vicious and sometimes weary. Someone might accuse Luía of having brought danger to new ground, of inviting the plantation's thunder to fall into a safer bay. Others defended her, saying that mothers had the right to prevent their children being counted as property. The balance of welcome and reproach made her feel as if she were perpetually being tried in the small courts of other people's hearts. Time, that old slow lapper, began to layer new days upon the older ones. Luía, though sheltered, bore a trace of exile in the way she slept, a foot always near the door, the pulse of readiness in the way she sat. Her hands, which had once traced Elisa's cheek and the seams of borrowed cloth, learned new calluses from different labors. She taught children in the Quilombo lullabies that kept names alive, and taught them to speak of the past in ways that would make it difficult for owners to pretend innocence. She spoke of Elisa sometimes, but often she let the name be an answer rather than a full confession. Across the years, the big house continued to perform its routines. Donna Mariana returned to receptions, to pruning roses, to ledger lines, but the way she moved through rooms altered subtly. She was guarded by a nervousness that had the look of someone who had been surprised by her own vulnerability. The scar, if the household allowed the term, left her face changed enough that gossip had work to do. Some said she had gone white with age. Others said she had become more austere. In private, she asked about the markets and the price of some goods, and was kinder at times to the infants she presented at table. Such gestures were small, ambivalent, and insufficient. The system that allowed her to sell a child remained intact. If anything, her world tightened around defensive graces and a more relentless insistence upon property's sanctity. Legal records, when they existed, were tidy and partial. The owner filed complaints. Investigations were initiated that had the air of formality, but not the teeth of impartial justice. Papers noted that intruders had acted and that the household had responded. Whether any formal trial punished the guilty in a manner the Quilombo felt was fair is unclear. Records are unclear, and rumors filled the space left by absent fact. In public, those in the owner's circle repeated a version of events that made the house innocent and the senzala culpable. In private, men who had once casually purchased human lives would sometimes murmur uneasily about cause and effect. Memory in the senzala hardened into patterns of storytelling that protected as much as they mourned. Women who remained taught the young one names and songs that could confuse a capataz's ear. Men who had not been sold taught children to whistle in rhythms that indicated safe routes. The story of Luía's act circulated like a hard seed. Some people swallowed it with pride, others spat it out as an indiscretion that invited suffering. Oral history in that place became an act of ownership over one's own narrative. By telling it, they refused the ledger's version. Years shifted like a tide. Luía grew older in the Quilombo, and she learned to stitch her grief into other things. One of the older women there, who had lost 2 sons to sail and gained none back, taught her to weave a sash with a tiny pocket sewn into the fibers, an echo of the secret pockets they had once used. Luía made a small keepsake out of that pocket, a remnant of cloth she had saved from Elisa's blanket. It did not make the absence disappear. It did something else. It allowed a tangible place to put name and memory, a pocket that kept the past from dissolving into rumor. The sash moved with her. When she wrapped it around her waist, it felt like an act of prayer. The Quilombo continued to be a place of moral conversation, and as seasons turned, those conversations evolved. New arrivals brought stories that complicated earlier certainties. A young woman arrived who had fought with a determination so cool it frightened even the elders. She argued that acts of resistance should aim at structures rather than persons. An elder insisted on the rightness of acts that protected children by any means necessary. Over years, these discussions would shape the Quilombo's practices. Some measures turned more defensive, others more prepared to disrupt markets and routes where sales were common. There was no monolithic doctrine. The community's moral architecture was built on the slow accretion of debates. Luía's relationship with memory was not static. Some nights she found herself sitting at the river, watching how light tilted on the water and thinking of Elisa's hand, small and trustingly curled, and she would whisper the name until the syllable was almost gone. Sometimes new mothers would come to her and ask about how to hold a newborn, and she would speak carefully, giving tactile advice on the small economy of feeding and warmth. People named children after Elisa too, sometimes as a deliberate act of keeping the absence alive, sometimes as a soft private praise. When a girl in the Quilombo bore Elisa as her given name, Luía felt an ache like a hand on her chest, and also a kind of dampened triumph. In some small way, the child who had been sold had returned to speech and to continuity. The story of the act itself, the thing done on the veranda, became a kind of seed for more stories. Travelers would come and leave and tell versions that gilded or made monstrous what had happened. Some described Luía as a saint avenger. Others reduced her to criminality. Historians of a later age might find such accounts and make them into neat essays about revolt, forgetting the messy particulars of human ties. But inside the Quilombo, the story remained a living thing, told at fires where pots simmered, murmured into the ears of children who would repeat names in sleep. Memory became a practice as much as a repository. The telling was a safeguard that refused erasure. At times people asked Luía, bluntly and with a kind of polite cruelty that is hard to distinguish from curiosity, whether she regretted what she had done. She would answer sometimes with silence, sometimes by telling a small detail, how the mistress once smoothed Elisa's hair in a way that made Luía think the woman had a soul, and then she would stop. Regret, she believed, was not a single feeling chartable in one direction. It was a layered geography of loss, of a mother's ache, of the knowledge of consequence. When pressed, she said that she had wanted one person to recognize the arithmetic of pain, to see that ownership made children into numbers. Whether the recognition had come in any meaningful way she could not say, When old men and women in the Quilombo taught younger ones to guard their lives and names, they often emphasized a cautious principle: make grief legible, but never leave yourself without refuge. The community enacted practical measures, protocols for flight, signals for danger, patterns for hiding children during market days. These measures were the gritty, unromantic labor of survival. They did not undo the injustice, but they made living under its shadow possible. The arc of Donna Mariana's life bent in ways the plantation's ledger could not easily register. She aged, and in some accounts became more withdrawn from social life. In others, she took up a new strictness that made her household's operations tighter. She had fewer invitations, some patrons whispering that scandal could mar their own reputations. Social rumors kept her company like a small, precise court. Still, she remained a woman with privileges that Luía would never again touch. Servants, land, the capacity to make transactions that shaped many lives. That the system continued is not a surprise. The system was not designed to be undone by one rupture. The scales of power were set deep. As decades passed, stories multiplied and softened. Some neighbors would say that the incident had been a turning point, a lesson taught in private that might have kept some hands from ever thinking to sell their children again. Others scoffed at such claims. A measure of quiet habits did change. Some masters, perhaps moved by fear or by guilt, or by the slow work of conscience, traded less recklessly. Whether these individual shifts represented any kind of structural reform is uncertain. Records are unclear. The law of the land, when it spoke, often sided with property, because property was how wealth was organized and defended. Luía lived out her years carrying both the sash with its pocket and the load of memory. When she was old, she would sit by a small window in the Quilombo meeting house and ply a needle while children ran in the dust. Young women who had children would come and ask for advice. She would talk to them about sewing and feeding, and about not letting their children be counted. Once, toward the end, she was asked whether she had forgiven Donna Mariana. Luía paused and said, "Forgiveness is a word for those who have power to measure their debts. I keep instead a ledger of what I teach my hands to do." The answer was not vindictive, nor was it absolution. It was a redirection toward practical care. In the years after, when stories were retold at festivals or in the hush of domestic hours, the event on the veranda became generative. It was invoked in cautious, moral conversations about what mothers could do, in songs that turned names into refrains, and in children's games where they pretended to trade and then pretend to refuse. The story became a way to articulate the world's injustices to those too young to remember the older plantations. Memory, in that sense, is a kind of inheritance. Luía's life closed without pageantry. She died in the waning season of a year that no ledger noticed. The Quilombo gathered in a manner that was intimate and unceremonious, hands on shoulders, sips of bitter tea, the exchange of small things. They wrapped her in a cloth that had been patched and repatched, and within its folds they put the remnant of Elisa's blanket. In the telling of those last moments, people said that Luía had smiled, a small private motion, and had whispered the name one last time. "Elisa," she breathed, and then, as if to make sure the name had weight in the world, she said it again. The silence after her leaving was not a tranquil blank, but a hum, a continuing thread of conversations that would not stop, because the injustices that birthed them did not stop. The Quilombo held memorials, songs and stories, and the children learned the name Elisa as both a litany and a lesson. Sometimes, on market days and in corners where older people spoke plainly, the story of that veranda was cited as an example of what happens when the law refuses to recognize personhood. In other places it was told quietly, so as not to invite the attention of those who could convert story into punishment. Memory persisted not only in ritual, but in the small structural shifts the Quilombo enacted, teaching names, training scouts, leaning on networks to make escape routes less deadly. These adjustments were not revolutionary in the sense of toppling plantations. They were the work of survival. They were an argument in action, that people who have been treated as property will teach their children otherwise. What the tableau leaves its audience with is not tidy. There is no neat justice served to balance the ledger. The big house keeps its walls and its roses. The Quilombo keeps its fires and its memory. Some of the women who had suffered sellings did not return. Some who remained carried new scars of loss, sales or beatings, or the bland erosion of daily insult. Luía's act did not dismantle the system. It changed the atmosphere in the rooms where decisions were made and in the hearths where names were preserved. That ambiguity is perhaps the core. One person's act of retribution can become a story that keeps alive the refusal to be counted. It can also be the seed of more suffering for those already precarious. The moral weight of that tension rests with the listener. To decide whether actions taken under duress are crimes or desperate pleas or both, history rarely gives clear verdicts. It offers instead the raw material for judgment, names, events, consequences, and asks us as inheritors what we will do with them. At the end of the day, the smallest thing persists, the name spoken aloud. Elisa remains a syllable that refuses to be folded into ledgers. In the Quilombo, the children learn to say it without apology. In farm markets and at well sides, the older ones murmur it when a child runs by. Names are the residue of personhood. Their repetition is the simplest form of resistance. The story ends not with an answer, but with a question placed in the listener's hands. What is justice when laws are designed to treat human beings as commodities? What does it mean to hold a moral life within a world that offers few institutional remedies for a mother's loss? These questions echo like the sound of hands beating cloth, unfinished, and needing more hands to answer. Comment one word: vengeance or excess. Share to keep this memory alive.